Before the world knew his name, he was just a boy with a rag-stuffed sock for a ball and a dream that felt too big for the dusty, sun-scorched streets of Bauru. We remember the 3 World Cups and the 1,000 goals, but we often forget that Pele didn't just play football, he saved the soul of a nation that had forgotten how to smile. To understand the king, you have to understand the heartbreak that birthed him. The year was 1950. Brazil was hosting the World Cup and the entire country was ready to crown itself champions. The atmosphere in Rio de Janeiro was electric. Streets were painted in gold and green, and a giant victory song had already been composed. But then, the Maracanazo happened. Uruguay silenced 200,000 people at the Maracanã, and a silence fell over Brazil that felt as if it would never lift. It wasn't just a lost game, it was a national tragedy that led to a collective identity crisis. People genuinely felt that Brazil was destined to be a lesser nation. The Complexo de Vira-Lata, or the mongrel complex, was born, a belief that Brazilians were inherently inferior to Europeans. The country was in mourning, and the suicide rate in Rio spiked that evening. A 9-year-old boy named Edson Arantes do Nascimento found his father, Dondinho, weeping in front of the radio. Dondinho was a talented player himself, whose career had been cut short by a brutal knee injury. His tears represented the shattered dreams of a generation. In that moment, the roles of father and son reversed. Edson looked at the man he idolized, touched his hand, and made a promise that seemed like a child's fantasy. "Don't cry, Papa. I will win the World Cup for you." At that moment, Edson wasn't a prodigy. He was just a son trying to heal his father's heart. Life in Bauru was a constant struggle for survival. Edson's family lived in a small house with a leaking roof and a floor often covered in bare earth. He worked as a shoeshine boy at the local train station, scrubbing the boots of wealthy businessmen for a few cents. But here is the part many don't know. He and his friends, calling themselves the Shoeless Ones, weren't just poor, they were a brotherhood. To afford a real leather ball, they used to steal peanuts from freight trains. They would wait for the steam engines to slow down, scramble onto the cars, and fill their pockets with raw peanuts to sell at the local cinema. It was dangerous, desperate work. When they finally saved enough for a ball, they treated it like a religious relic. Edson's training consisted of dribbling through narrow alleys with a grapefruit or a sock stuffed with newspaper and tied with a string. But he had a rhythm that no one else possessed, the Ginga. It was a movement born from capoeira and samba, a fluid, unpredictable grace. When his mother, Celeste, saw him playing, she worried. She had seen how football broke her husband's body and left them with nothing. She wanted Edson to be a scholar, not a dreamer. But the ball was a magnet, and Edson was the steel. When Edson was 15, his mentor, Waldemar de Brito, took him to the coast to try out for Santos FC. Brito famously told the directors, "This boy will be the greatest football player in the world." They laughed. Edson was scrawny, his clothes were ill-fitting, and he looked like he hadn't had a full meal in weeks. During his first practice, the senior players tried to intimidate him. They played hard, throwing shoulders and sliding into his ankles, but Edson didn't flinch. He used his Ginga to dance around them, leaving grown men tripping over their own feet. He was so fast and so technically gifted that within days the club realized they didn't just have a player, they had a phenomenon. He signed his first contract for a pittance, sending every cent back home to his mother so she could finally buy a new stove. Fast forward to 1958. The setting is Sweden. The air is biting, the grass is slick with dew, and the Brazilian squad arrives looking like outsiders. Among them is a 17-year-old with a knee injury and a smile that could light up a stadium. He was so young and looked so innocent that the Swedish locals were fascinated by him. But the Brazilian team doctor and psychologist were worried. They ran tests on the players and concluded that Pele was too infantile and lacked the fighting spirit needed for a World Cup. They recommended he be dropped. Thankfully, the veteran players, led by the legendary Garrincha, revolted. They told the coach, "If Pele doesn't play, we don't play." When Pele finally stepped onto the pitch against the USSR, the world changed. Imagine the scene, the towering physical defenders of Europe looking down at this teenager, only to find themselves chasing a shadow. He wasn't just fast, he was thinking 3 moves ahead. He moved with a spatial awareness that defied physics, finding pockets of air where others saw only walls of defenders. The 1958 semi-final against France was a massacre, a hat-trick in 23 minutes. But the final against Sweden was the masterpiece. In the 55th minute, Pele produced a moment of magic that remains the benchmark for greatness. He chested a high ball down under intense pressure, flicked it over the head of a stunned defender without it ever touching the grass, and volleyed it into the corner of the net. There is a moment right after that goal that many forget. The Swedish defender, Sig Parling, later admitted, "After the 5th goal, I didn't want to tackle him. I wanted to applaud." Even the King of Sweden descended from the stands to shake the hand of the 17-year-old. When the final whistle blew, the weight of the 1950 promise finally hit him. Pele collapsed into the arms of his teammates, sobbing uncontrollably. He had done it. He had healed a nation. By 1961, Pele was the most wanted man on the planet. Inter Milan had actually signed a contract with him, but when the news leaked in Brazil, fans burned down the club's headquarters in Rio. The outrage was so intense that the Brazilian president, Jânio Quadros, had to intervene. Fearing a literal revolution if their idol left for Europe, Quadros passed a bill officially declaring Pele a non-exportable national treasure. This wasn't just a nickname, it was a legal status. For the next decade, Pele was legally prohibited from being sold to a foreign club. Think about the psychological weight of that. To be a human being legally bound to your soil because your presence was the only thing keeping the national spirit alive. He was a prisoner of his own greatness, a king who wasn't allowed to leave his kingdom. Because he couldn't leave, Pele turned Santos FC into a global powerhouse. Alongside legends like Pepe and Coutinho, they played a brand of football so offensive and so fluid it was dubbed the White Ballet. They didn't just play in Brazil, they toured the world like the Beatles. The schedule was grueling. They would play 3 matches in 3 different countries in a single week. Pele was the main attraction, and the crowds were often violent in their affection. In one match in South America, Pele was sent off by a referee. The crowd was so furious that they rioted, forced the referee to flee the stadium, and demanded Pele come back onto the pitch to finish the game. The substitute referee literally had to apologize to Pele to restart the match. By the end of this era, Pele's physical peak was terrifying. He was a perfect athlete. He could outjump goalkeepers who were 6 inches taller, and he possessed a 6th sense for where the ball would land. But as we move into the next chapter of his life, we see the dark side of this fame, the physical toll of being a marked man, and the brutal realization that the world wanted to see the king fall. As the 1960s progressed, the world of football changed. The game became more tactical, more defensive, and significantly more violent. For the defenders of Europe and South America, Pele wasn't just an opponent, he was a target. In 1962, Brazil traveled to Chile to defend its crown. Pele was at the absolute zenith of his physical powers, scoring a solo goal against Mexico that defied belief. But then, the tragedy of 1950 returned in a different form. A severe muscle tear in the second match forced him to the sidelines. He had to watch, helpless and hurting, as Garrincha took the mantle. Brazil won, but Pele felt like a ghost at his own feast. By 1966, England's brutality reached a breaking point. This is a dark chapter, often glossed over. The world saw the greatest player on earth being systematically dismantled. In the matches against Bulgaria and Portugal, Pele was hacked, tripped, and stamped upon. There were no yellow cards, no red cards to protect him. The image of Pele limping off the pitch at Goodison Park, draped in a gray blanket with his head bowed, remains one of the most heartbreaking images in sports history. He was so demoralized by the lack of protection from officials that he sat in the locker room and made a vow. I will never play in a World Cup again. The game has become a war, and I am a man of peace. While he retreated from the international stage, his legend only grew. In 1969, a story unfolded that sounds like a movie script, but it was entirely real. Nigeria was embroiled in a bloody, devastating civil war. However, when it was announced that Santos was coming to Lagos to play an exhibition match, something miraculous happened. The Nigerian government and the secessionist state of Biafra agreed to a 48-hour ceasefire. The guns went silent. The soldiers on both sides laid down their rifles, walked to the stadium, and sat by side in the stands to watch the king. For 90 minutes, there was no tribe, no politics, and no blood. There was only the ball. Pele later remarked that he didn't realize the gravity of it until he saw the soldiers crying at the final whistle. He had become the only person on earth who could pause a war just by showing up. It was the moment he realized his life belonged to more than just a football club. He was a symbol of hope for the entire world. Back in Brazil, a new obsession took hold. O milésimo. Pele was approaching his 1,000th career goal. The pressure was suffocating. In every match he played, the crowd didn't care about the final score. They only cared whether the king would find the net. He admitted later that he started having nightmares about missing open goals. In one match in northeastern Brazil, he scored a goal. Still, the referee, who wanted the historic 1,000th goal to happen in the legendary Maracanã, actually disallowed it on a technicality, just to keep the suspense alive. Finally, on November 19, 1969, the moment arrived. It was a penalty against Vasco da Gama. The Maracanã held 80,000 people, but as Pele stepped up to the spot, it fell so silent you could hear the Atlantic wind whistling through the concrete tiers. Even the Vasco goalkeeper, Andrada, was in tears, torn between his duty to save it and his desire to be part of history. When the ball hit the back of the net, the game simply evaporated. Hundreds of people rushed the pitch. Pele was hoisted onto shoulders, sobbing. He didn't talk about his greatness that night. He grabbed a microphone and in front of millions pleaded, "For the love of God, look after the children, look after the poor." He used his greatest personal milestone to remind a military-ruled Brazil that its people were suffering. As 1970 approached, the pressure for Pelé to return to the national team became political. The military dictatorship in Brazil wanted him to play to boost national morale. Pelé was 29, and many critics, including the Brazilian coach at the time, João Saldanha, claimed he was washed up and that his eyesight was failing. Pelé took this personally. In the months leading up to Mexico 70, he began a secret, brutal training regimen. He would spend hours in the pitch-black darkness of a gym, practicing his reaction times and his peripheral vision. He worked on his headers until his forehead was bruised, aiming for a specific brick on a wall. He wasn't just preparing for a tournament, he was preparing for an apotheosis. He wanted to prove that a king doesn't just age, he evolves. The 1970 World Cup was the first broadcast in color, and it felt as if the world was finally seeing Pelé as he was meant to be seen. He was no longer the lightning-fast teenager of 58, he was a master conductor. This was the tournament of the perfect misses. The halfway line shot against Czechoslovakia, the dummy against Uruguay where he ran around the keeper without touching the ball. These moments were more beautiful than the goals of other legends. The final against Italy at the Azteca Stadium was the emotional climax of a 20-year journey. When he rose into the air for that opening header, he stayed in the sky. He seemed to defy gravity, hovering for a split second longer than humanly possible. When Brazil won 4-1, the pitch was a sea of humanity. Fans stripped him of his jersey, his boots, and even his socks, just to have a relic of the man who had given them everything. Pelé was carried off on shoulders, a golden trophy in one hand and the heart of the world in the other. He had finally fulfilled the promise to his father 3 times over. In 1975, Pelé did the unthinkable. He came out of retirement to join the New York Cosmos. American soccer was a punchline at the time. When he arrived for his first match at Downing Stadium, he looked at the pitch and recoiled. It was a mess of dirt and weeds. To make it look professional for the TV cameras, the groundskeepers had used green spray paint to cover the dirt patches. By halftime, Pelé's legs and boots were covered in green slime. He could have walked away. He could have demanded a better stadium. Instead, he laughed, cleaned his boots, and went back out. He invited Muhammad Ali to his matches. He hosted Mick Jagger in the locker room, and he single-handedly made football cool in the United States. He wasn't there for the money. He was there on a mission to spread the gospel of the game. Without Pelé in 1975, the sport would never have taken root in the soil of North America. Pelé's final match in 1977 was a poetic masterpiece. He played one half for the New York Cosmos and one half for his beloved Santos. As he left the pitch for the last time, the heavens opened and a torrential rain began to fall in New Jersey. A Brazilian newspaper headline the next day read, "Even the sky was crying." His legacy isn't found in the dusty trophies at the Santos Museum. It is found in the number 10. Before Pelé, the number 10 was just a mathematical requirement. After him, it became the mantle of the genius, the playmaker, the savior. When you see a kid today in a rural village in Africa or a high-rise in Tokyo wearing a number 10 jersey, they are wearing Pelé's shadow. He passed away in 2022, but a king like that never truly leaves. He exists in every street kid playing barefoot in the rain with a ball made of rags. He exists in the Ginga that still flows through the veins of Brazilian football. He taught us that football isn't just a sport, it is an instrument of peace, a canvas for art, and a bridge between the poor and the powerful. He was Edson Arantes do Nascimento, the boy who promised his father a trophy. He ended up giving the world its soul. Pelé once said that he was born for football, just as Beethoven was born for music. If you could have 1 minute to ask the king a single question about his journey, what would it be? Share your questions and your favorite Pelé memories in the comments. I read every single one. To see more deep dives into the legends who built this game and to check out the limited edition Chronicles of Football gear, click the links in the description below. See you in the next chapter.